If you've watched the first video for this lesson, you will know how to order fractions when you've either got a common denominator or a common numerator. In this video, we'll look at examples which are a little more tricky because you won't have a common denominator or a common numerator in the list. In question 1, the order of these fractions isn't obvious straight away. What we'd like to do is try and get either a common denominator or a common numerator for this question. Looking at the numbers here, it's going to be easier to try and get a common denominator, at least for most of these fractions. Most of the numbers are actually factors of 30, so we could easily convert all of these into 30ths. The one exception being 2/13ths, which might be tricky, but we can deal with that at the end. So I'm going to list all of these fractions out again with a denominator of 30. Let's start with 2/5. To get a denominator of 30, I need to multiply the numerator and denominator by 6. That's going to give me 12/30ths. 3/10 is going to be 9/30ths. 4/5 is going to be 24/30ths. 13/30ths is still 13/30ths. 7/10 is going to be 21/30ths. We're going to leave out 2/13ths for a second, and 11/15ths is going to be 22/30. Out of the fractions we've found here, 9/30ths is the smallest. Now 9/30ths is equivalent to 3/10, and we can use that to compare it with 2/13ths. Now 2/13ths is smaller than 3/10 because the denominator is bigger. That means we're dealing with smaller slices, and we haven't even got as many of them. We've only got 2 of these really small slices as opposed to 3 of these slices which are slightly bigger. So that means 2/13ths is going to be the smallest fraction. So I'm going to write that first. We're starting with 2/13ths, and then we need to put all of these fractions in order now. That is 9/30ths first of all, which was 3/10 in the original list, so I'm going to write it as 3/10. We've dealt with that one. After 9/30ths, the next one is 12/30ths, which was 2/5 in the original list, so I'm going to write 2/5. Next here is 13/30ths, which was 13/30ths in the original list, so we just write it like that. Next is 21/30ths, which was 7/10. So 7/10 is next. Then we have 22/30ths, which was 11/15. And finally, we've got 24/30ths, which was 4/5. And we did deal with this one. We saw at the beginning that that was the smallest fraction here. In question 2, we have again got a list of fractions where we don't have a common numerator and we don't have a common denominator. We need to try and get a common numerator or common denominator. In this question, it is going to be easier to try and get a common numerator. We can easily make all of these numbers into 8s. To turn 2/7 into 8 over something, we need to multiply the numerator by 4, which means we need to multiply the denominator by 4 as well. So that's going to give us 8/28. So I'm just writing out this list as equivalent fractions. 4/15ths is going to be 8/30ths, multiplying the top and bottom by 2. 2/9 is going to be 8/36. Thereof multiply the top and bottom by 4. 8/9 is still 8/9, and 8/27 is 8/27 still. So what we've done is find equivalent fractions for this list. Now we've got common numerators, it's easy to put them in order. Remember, the fraction with the biggest denominator is going to be the smallest fraction, because the big denominator means we've got really small slices. Therefore, the ordered list is as follows. The smallest fraction is the one with the biggest denominator, that's 8/36, which was 2/9. So we've dealt with that one. Then we've got 8/30ths, which was 4/15. Then we have 8/28, which is 2/7. Then we have 8/27, which was just 8/27. And finally, we've got 8/9. So we've dealt with all of those fractions and put them in order. In question 3, we have mixed numbers. By looking at the whole number parts of these, it should be obvious straight away that these two are going to be the smaller two because you've only got one whole and a bit, and this fraction and this fraction at the end are going to be the larger two fractions because you've got 2 and a bit in both cases. So all we need to do is decide within those pairs which comes first and which comes second. Let's start with these two, 1 and 4/5 and 1 and 5/6. Now, we don't have a common numerator or a common denominator in these cases, but without too much work, you should hopefully see that 1 and 4/5 is the smaller fraction because that is 1/5 away from 2. You have to add on a fifth to get up to 2. Whereas with this fraction, you have to add on 1/6 to get to 2. And 1/6 is smaller than 1/5. So we only need to add on a sixth here, as opposed to 1/5 for this one. So 1 and 5/6 is closer to 2, and therefore that's the bigger number of those two, 1 and 5/6. Right, we've dealt with those. We can use a similar logic again now with 2 and 3/4 and 2 and 6/7. They're both just under 3, but how close are they to 3? To get to 3 from here, you would need to add on a quarter. To get to 3 from this number, you would need to add on only 1/7. A seventh is smaller than a quarter, so this number is closer to 3, and therefore it's bigger. That means 2 and 3/4 is the smaller one, so that comes before 2 and 6/7, which is the last one in the list. So that is our ordered list of fractions. This kind of logic can save you time when you're ordering fractions like this, but if you didn't spot that, you could still do it the more traditional way. You could try and find a common denominator for your fractions or a common numerator and then put them in order using the skills you have from the earlier part of the lesson. In question 4, we have 3 fractions. Like all the examples in this video, we don't have a common numerator and we don't have a common denominator. Now, it's going to be a lot of work to try and get a common numerator or a common denominator because these numbers are particularly nasty. That's fine, we can still use some sort of logic to help us put these in order without needing to do any complicated calculations. The first thing to spot in this question is that all of these fractions are pretty close to a half. Imagine a cake that's been cut into 23 slices. If you take 11 out of 23, you've got just under half of the cake there. It's the same situation here. If there are 37 slices but you take 18 of them, you've got just under a half. 18 would be half of 36, so you've got just less than a half. And similarly, 23 is just under a half of 47 as well. So what we can try and do is see how close these fractions are to a half. Now, to make life a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is multiply the top and bottom by 2. And you'll see why that's helpful in a moment. So as equivalent fractions, I've got here 22 over 46. There's 36 over 74 and 46 over 94. So the same fractions I've written as equivalent fractions now. And how close are these fractions to a half? What I'm going to write in green is how much we need to add on to get to a half. We know that 23 46ths would be a half. 23 is half of 46. So you need to add on one more 46th to get to a half from this fraction, 11 over 23. With this one, we know that 37 74ths is a half. So to get to 37 74ths, you need to add on one more 74th. So 18 37ths is 1/74th away from being a half. And similarly, this fraction is 1/94th away from being a half. 47 over 94 would be equivalent to a half. So we need to add on one more 94th. Now, what does this tell us? Which of these is closest to a half? Well, it's this one. It's the closest because you need to add on the smallest fraction. 1/94th is a tiny, tiny fraction. That's one whole cut into 94 little slices. To reiterate then, we have all of these fractions which are very close to a half. If I mark it on a number line, we have something like this. Here's a half on the number line, and what we're saying is that all of these fractions were just below a half, remember, but 23/47 was the closest. So 23/47 is going to be somewhere around here. And we're saying that 18/37 is 1/74 away. And that's a bigger fraction than 1/94, so it's further away from a half. It's down here somewhere. So that's where 18/37 is. And finally, 1/46, that's the biggest fraction, so 11/23 is the furthest away from a half. So 11/23 is down here. You need to add on the biggest amount more to get to a half. So the order of these three fractions is as follows. 11 over 23 is the smallest, then 18 over 37, and finally 23 over 47. So the list is actually already in order.